What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the latest installment into the Rebel Moon series from Zack Snyder, and that film is called Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Once again directed by Zack Snyder, who wrote this film alongside Shay Hatton and Kurt Johnstad. This film once again stars people like Sofia Boutella, Michael Huisman, Jimon Honsu, and more. So for those of you who have been following the channel since at least the last time that I covered the Rebel Moon series, you know that at the tail end of last year, right before this actually hit Netflix, the first part, I actually got to check it out via a press and media invite to check it out in theaters, which allowed me to check it out a little bit before it hit Netflix, and excited the ever-living fuck out of me, to be completely and utterly honest, because I had seen the marketing. It seemed like it was right up my alley. I love Zack Snyder. While I don't love all of his films, I'm always intrigued to see what he does. And it was pretty much marketed as Zack Snyder's version of Star Wars. It's what inspired him. I won't sit here and regurgitate a lot of the things I said in that original review, but naturally that excited me as a diehard fan of Star Wars. Anybody who has followed this channel knows it's my favorite thing of all time outside of the movies and the TV shows, the books, the video games, the comics. So when I heard that Zack Snyder, who is just visually awesome when it comes to his movies and a lot of times can create fun and compelling stories, was going to be doing his own version of Star Wars in a way, I was all in. And ultimately, go back and check out the review if you're interested in my thoughts on the first movie, but the best way I can really sum up my thoughts on that first movie is that it had all the right potential. You have a solid cast, all giving solid performances for the most part. You have a universe that is clearly referencing Star Wars in so many ways, which instantly kind of piques my interest. But outside of that is a sci-fi and fantasy film, which is right up my alley. My favorite genres are sci-fi and fantasy. So when you blend the two together, I'm already interested. The world that Zack Snyder created, of course, while inspired by so many other sci-fi fantasy franchises, were so cool. I really loved the look, the feel, the vibe. There was so much done well with the costume design, the set design, the locations, the CGI. All of that I thought was really great, and I really enjoyed the look, the feel, the vibe, the musical score of that first film. But ultimately, the movie can really be summed up as character introduction, the movie, as majority of the movie focuses on introducing new characters using flashbacks or exposition to give us some sort of information on them, but never actually having true character development through the narrative that we're following. And this all kind of leads up to one final showdown where the villain, played by Skrein, is killed, and he is revived in the post-credit scene or at the very end of the film, ultimately to be brought back into this film as the main threat once again. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, it was just missed opportunity with that first film. Beautiful when it comes down to the filmmaking and the performances, but very lackluster when it came down to the narrative and the characters. So here we are now with the sequel, The Scargiver, which I went into it with high hopes. However, I had already seen some of my peers' reviews on Letterboxd and on YouTube, all giving it pretty mediocre to really just straight up bad reviews. And I'm happy to say I didn't necessarily hate the film. I didn't find it to be as bad as some are saying it is, but I do recognize that part of that is my absolute love for the genre of sci-fi and fantasy. Once again, Zack Snyder delivers a beautiful looking film. I think the action in this film, similar to the first film, is top tier. I love the look, the feel, the vibe. There might be a little bit too much slow-mo, but that is Zack Snyder's thing, and I can't necessarily continually knock him for something that I know is his style, but there might be a little bit too much of that. But visually, again, I love the film. When it came down to the performances as well, I thought that was all solid. The visual effects are great. The costume design, the set design, the locations that they go to, the concepts, the world that's clearly inspired by my favorite universe, Star Wars. All of that was just singing true to me and who I am and my personal taste. But unfortunately, as the movie progressed, I realized that it was kind of suffering from a lot of the same issues that you had in the first film, which was simply a lackluster narrative. There are moments in this film, as it's a continuation to the last one, that feel like they have far more conclusions to the first film, which allowed me to enjoy this film a little bit more. But there's also moments in this film that just ultimately don't feel earned, or I feel like the movie wants me as an audience member to feel more for the characters that are at stake here, and ultimately I just didn't. The base premise of this film is that Skrein character has been resurrected. He now knows where Sofia Boutella's character is. Of course, in the first film, she was part of a village. She was hiding out there. We learned that she had history with this motherland empire that's essentially this universe's version of the empire. And now Skrein is going back to that village that she was trying to protect in the first film. to try to kill her. Now, during the events of the first film, Sofia Boutella's character went on a search for all these various characters to kind of build together a team to protect her village. Now all those characters are with her at this village at the beginning of the second one. Skrein is on his way after being resurrected, and this ultimately leads to a big showdown between all these characters, Skrein and his empire, at the very end of the film. And so in a lot of ways, at least it has some conclusion to the events that you see in the first film to some degree, while also setting up the next Rebel Moon film. But it goes without saying that still a lot of those issues that you had in the first film are wildly present. You have all of these main characters who were introduced briefly in the first film and not given much to do or say. You don't really learn a bunch about them in the first film, only for them to be more integral in this film, but you ultimately still don't know anything about them. There's one defined scene in this movie where they're all sitting at a table on one of the random nights in preparation for this army to come to the village. And they use this moment for all the characters to just give a flashback storyline where they kind of narrate over it and allow us to understand more about them and where they've come from. And that's kind of where these films suffer, is that majority of the character development is done via these slow motion flashbacks and through narration and exposition, versus us getting to know who these characters are through actual events in the film themselves. And while this film does lead to some pretty badass action that was entertaining to watch, which I think is why I'm a little bit more positive on this one than I am on the first one, it ultimately, again, just still suffers from a lackluster and hollow story. And with having seen both movies be about 2 hours or a little bit over 2 hours, I'm at a place now where I'm pretty much convinced that both of these movies could have been crammed into one 3-hour epic with a couple of things being trimmed out. I ultimately feel like some of the main characters in this film, both of these films, could easily have been just completely trimmed out of the story altogether, because they don't really serve much of a story at all, and that extra screen time that was given to them could have really been going to the characters that are far more central in here, most notably Sofia Boutella's character and Michael Huisman's character. One character that I enjoyed a lot more this time was Jimone's Hansu's character, General Titus, who I think is given a lot more to do here. You can at least understand a little bit more of what his motivation is and what his drive is to be a part of this team is throughout the course of the film. But ultimately, again, they just don't do enough with any of these characters for me to have ever cared. There's all-out action and war happening in the last part of this movie, and while it's all visually very enticing and cool to see, there were characters that die in the mix, some of them being more main characters, some of them being more side characters, random villagers that you had a couple of scenes with. And the movie, sometimes with the music swelling up and the way that it's all edited, you can tell wants you to feel more for these characters. And that part of me that's in love with the look and the feel of the movie wants to feel more connected with these moments. But ultimately, when characters are dying, I just never have anything that's happening in the story for me to care enough for them to die. Similar to the first film, you have characters like Tarak, played by Stasner, who's just kind of there. He's got some cool action sequences, he looks great in the role, but ultimately doesn't have an abundance to really do in the movie narratively. And on top of him, Beiduna's character Nemesis, another character who we learn a little bit more about in this movie, but ultimately not enough for me to really care about the events that unfold around her character in this movie. I mean, she's ultimately there with some cool action sequences, but that's about it. And while I enjoy Skrein as the villain in these films, I think he's definitely leaning into this very Star Wars Imperial vibe. He's leaning into the very over-the-top, cocky, snarky villain. He ultimately in this film is almost given less to do than he was in the first film. He's just a villain who was resurrected with a very samey plot and samey kind of vision from the first film. His goal is pretty much the same, and he doesn't really do much else other than fight in the end, other than a couple of scenes of him talking and directing people to do certain things. And the story never builds up a narrative that ever makes you feel afraid of him. Anthony Hopkins is in these films as well. I briefly mentioned him in the first review. He plays a robot who was part of the Imperial Army but has enough sentience to kind of realize that he doesn't want to side with them anymore, and really had nothing to do in the first film. He seemed like a promising character in the first few minutes, but ultimately disappears for majority of the runtime and randomly shows up at the end of the first film with a headpiece made of antlers. In this film, he's just kind of lingering around until the very end, where he has a lot more to do, so I'm glad they did more with his character. But Anthony Hopkins as well, with this very interesting, cool-looking character, doesn't really have an abundance to do. The character himself has some really cool moments, way more to do in this film than in the first one, but again, ultimately not really a character that they do in abundance with. And if I had to praise any of the character work that was done in this film, it would mainly go specifically to the relationship between Sofia Boutella's character and Michael Huisman's character, Cora and Gunn. Gunner. The two of them were the most interesting characters throughout the course of the film. I felt their relationship the most. I think that there was at least something that the first film was able to kind of launch off for their connection to kind of work throughout the course of the film. But kind of similarly, we get to the end of the film and there's just this feeling that not enough has been done. We've seen tons of films do a lot in 2 hours when it comes down to pacing, character work, and allowing you to actually feel like you saw a story, a 3-act structure, something that has ups and downs and allows you to feel for the characters and get to know them and allows you to be rooting for them in the final act. But in the case of this movie, I just look at 2 hugely long films that have just so much fluff and so much exposition, but not enough story and narrative that actually builds upon what you're actually doing here, to the point where you kind of just can't necessarily disagree with people who hate these films, but at the same time they're so well made that I can never be surprised if somebody actually really enjoys these films. And in the case of myself, I just find myself torn right in the middle. I find these films to be beautifully well made. I think this film, The Scargiver, has some really great action in it. There are some really solid moments of visuals, and I just love the production value of these movies. Again, as a huge fan of just world building and lore and sci-fi and fantasy, the look, the feel, the vibe, and the little things that they kind of do to make this world feel alive, I think is really cool. But I just wish that I cared about the characters. I just wish that I cared about what was going on in the story, and that I didn't just feel like a predictable sci-fi fantasy film that you've seen time and time again. It's just essentially, it feels like the greatest hits of other things, but not put together in the best way to actually make this have its own identity and have a story that makes you as a viewer want to return to it. So that's going to be my thoughts on Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. There's a lot of potential here. I'm hoping the third film is a lot stronger, but honestly, with these first 2 installments, I don't necessarily have the most excitement for it, and I can't necessarily disagree 100% with everybody who hates the film, and I can't necessarily disagree with the people who think the film is really cool. I'm right down the middle. However, I will say I think there are some people who are dogging on this film way worse than it's deserved. I've seen way worse films this year than this one, and some people are calling this one of the worst movies of the year. I've seen way worse already this year, and so it was entertaining enough. I don't necessarily know that I'm dying to revisit this movie, but I am looking forward to the sequel to just see if it's able to kind of bring it all together, and if Zack Snyder can at least kind of take some of the notes that fans are throwing his way. I want to see this franchise succeed. There's so many pieces about it that work for me, but ultimately just the full picture just isn't there to really create something compelling and long lasting that we audience members are going to want to watch time and time again. So a big thanks to you guys for watching. Let me know what you guys think about this second installment into the Rebel Moon franchise down below, and I'll see you beautiful people in the next one. Bye-bye.